Hey everyone, my name is Darcy Ungaro, and you're watching The Everyday Investor. Today I'm catching up with Michael Every, and he's the global strategist at Rabobank. Now, Michael is an interesting character. He speaks multiple languages. He's done time in Russia, so he knows from the inside out what's going on over there. But what we're talking about is we're talking about the meta crisis, and we're talking about the new mercantile regime that we might be heading into as part of this multipolar world that seems to be emerging around us. Do we have what it takes as politicians, as economists, as business owners, as citizens of the world to get from A to B with what's going on? Well, we're going to find out. So hope you enjoy this one. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this, but let's get started. So I'm joined in the studio here with Michael Every from Rabobank. How are you, Michael? You good?
I'm good, thank you very much. Just got over food poisoning, but feeling much better today.
Well, I really appreciate you joining us and making the time to have a chat to me, because there's a lot of questions that I have, and it's hard to find someone who has the breadth and the depth to discuss some of these things. So again, really looking forward to this. I'd like to start off with a comment that I heard you make somewhere. I can't remember where it was, but somewhere where you said that you are a post Keynesian. And I want to unpack what that means, and then also kind of get into this new mercantile world that we might be heading into. So do you want to start off with defining what post Keynesianism means?
So the traditional market view of how things works is what you might call the neoclassical view. That's where most people who are defining themselves as economists or strategists sit, but they actually don't know that's where they sit because they're not even aware of other alternative economic or market viewpoints. If you're a neoclassical guy or lady, effectively, that means that you think that the less the government gets involved, the better, generally speaking, that supply always meets demand after a lag, and that things pretty much rebalance. Everything is more or less like a giant seesaw that if you push down, something comes up, then it goes back down again. It's a nice mechanical view of the world. It's extremely utopian, desperately unrealistic in terms of how things actually work, particularly over the longer run. But it's very popular because it justifies most of the time doing things like cutting taxes for the rich and saying that will make everyone better off in the long run. So it's a very popular long run school. And as I said, it's the only one they teach pretty much in schools or universities. It's the only one anyone working for a central bank will be familiar with. So that's your neoclassical school. Then you've got the Austrian school, which is much more hardcore, and they basically believe, A, you can't model an economy, which I think they're correct about, and B, when you artificially try and set the cost of interest via a central bank, all you do is artificially create bubbles which will burst over time because of bad investment that flows from the back of them, and that creates inflation, asset bubbles, and they need to be removed. Now, Austrians believe that the only way you can stop this happening is to take the power away from central banks and governments and give it to markets, which means that we should all be using gold for money. So if you all use gold for money, we all have this straitjacket that we can't spend too much, and the interest rate is set by basically the price of gold, effectively. That has historically ended extremely badly for reasons I don't really think I need to go into here, but it's a pretty an artificial way of looking at the world. Then you've got the Marxist view, which is increasingly popular again in different ways, which is basically saying that capitalism is prone to massive crises, which it is because of how badly it treats workers, which is largely true. And that critique, I think, is very powerful, even if it's fundamentally flawed in some key respects. But what Marxism doesn't tell you is what you should then do about it, which is not a lot. And then you have the post-Keynesian camp, who argue that, okay, we agree with parts of what everyone is saying, but we agree with Austrians to a degree. And we can see a little bit of what the neoclassical school is saying, although actually things do blow up quite a lot. And we can agree with a lot of what the Marxists are saying to a degree. But how do we balance all that? And the post-Keynesians basically say the government's job is to run a large deficit to make sure that the private sector runs a surplus, which is generally a healthy thing for the private sector to be doing. And that if you're running a shortfall anywhere in the economy, it's the government and the central bank's job to try and fill that gap. And you can do it via printing money if you have to, provided you don't have a problem with inflation. Now, if you have a problem with inflation, you can't do that. You can only do that when you have a problem with deflation, that you don't have enough demand. A post-Keynesian says, if you actually look at the long run, the post-Keynesians, I think, have the cleverest answer in most circumstances, except when you have inflation as a problem because you don't control your own supply chain, which is true for most economies, for example, New Zealand nowadays, certainly true for the US, it's true for most of the West. When you're in that particular situation, you can no longer go down the post-Keynesian route, because if you print money then, all you do get is more inflation, because the people who do produce goods say, you're printing money, why should we give you goods for them? We're going to withhold goods. In which case, the key underlying message is you have to run a trade surplus. So if you take back control of industrial production and commodities and supply chains, and you control everything from upstream to downstream, and you have excess capacity in your economy by design, then you can print money to stimulate as needed. You don't have to rely on anyone else, and you actually get to set the pattern for everybody else in terms of how things work. That's post-Keynesianism. It's also, as you alluded to, mercantilism, because it's zero sum, because not everyone can do it. If you're controlling everything, not everyone else can be controlling everything. If you're completely independent, either everyone's completely independent, which means we have autarky everywhere and no one trades, which is unrealistic, or we're all being dominated by one block or one large economy. And that is where we are heading to right now.
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot to unpack in there, and that's kind of part of it, right? Like effectively, all we have is a history of a whole bunch of isms that we can recycle and repurpose, but every now and then we kind of have to stop and see the world for what it is, but then also, I guess, recognize that history does rhyme, right? We kind of see just reiterations over time. So are we kind of like at that tipping point now where maybe economists need to kind of study things for what they really are and come up with a new ism, or really is it just coming to grips with this new type of mercantilism?
Well, we can do both at the same time. I think they're two sides of the same coin. I think it's essential we do that, to look at the world the way it really is, to do that from a more cross-disciplinary perspective. For example, you can't take a purist view and say, we want to do X, Y, Z. I mean, let me give you a concrete example. Just today, I just published a note in the background before starting this chat with you, where the European Union are vociferously pushing back against the US Inflation Reduction Act, which they recently passed as a benchmark piece of legislation for President Biden. And that introduces, amongst many other things, subsidies and tax credits and local content provision for a new green industrial supply chain within the US, basically saying we're going to reindustrialize, take supply chains back onshore, and go green that way with the government behind it. It was never going to happen any other way in the US. And we've got COP27 happening in the background, where the UN Secretary General says we're on the highway to hell with our foot on the accelerator. That's literally what the guy just said. That's how bad things are. You've got the US saying, okay, we're going to go green and put the full weight of the government behind it to bring supply chains back, to make sure that we have subsidies to get this done as soon as possible. And the Europeans, who do nothing but talk about going green and how green is their big thing, are attacking the US for doing it, because they're saying, but hang on, that means you'll have all the supply chains and we won't have them. Mm-hmm. So what do we want? Do we want to save the planet, or is it more important to say, but free trade? This is what I'm saying. We need to square the circle of what really matters, what ism is important: neoliberalism, mercantilism, environmentalism. What combination do we stick to? What does the real world look like, rather than the ideal world of, well, yeah, but we want to save the planet and save free trade. Can you do that? I don't think you can. So which one are you going to sacrifice as a result? So that's a concrete example. But the sad fact of the matter is we are seeing major institutions, like all the economists in the EU at an institutional level, all saying, no, free trade, WTO. It's like, well, what's more important? We've just been told we're all going to die if we don't act on this. But no, that doesn't matter. It's more important that we make sure the jobs are in Europe, not America.
How does the Russian invasion of Ukraine kind of accelerate that? Like, we know that COVID accelerated a whole bunch of stuff that was pre-existing, but how did the Russian invasion of Ukraine accelerate some of this and put pressure on that what you were just describing before?
Well, sadly, it's been an accelerator for some, in that they've woken up and realized, goodness me, we live in a world where countries can still be invaded, where you can have a major European capital like Kiev being told yesterday that you're not going to have any electricity or water this winter, so you might want to be prepared to flee. So we could see the population of Kiev basically decamping to Western Ukraine or even into the European Union this winter. That's the reality of the world we now live in. That can happen again, and that can happen in other places. So if that isn't a wake-up call, I don't know what is. And yet the sad fact is, it still isn't a wake-up call for some people. I deal with people institutionally and professionally who see this, and I deal with others who are immediately in denial and want to go back to the same talking points, talking about the stock market, talking about utopian views of how markets do and don't work, and just pretending it all, putting their fingers in their ears, hands over their eyes, and just thinking we can carry on as normal and the world will be, as we want it to be. So it's worrying from the real world perspective, and it's worrying from the people not seeing the real world perspective.
I believe you kind of called this right in terms of Russia making that move in January. And I remember at the time myself, I was writing some stuff around potentially war happening in January as well, but I didn't pick Russia. I was thinking more China. So how did you kind of come to that conclusion, though, that you thought that Putin would indeed pull the trigger? What was it that kind of made you think, hey, this is really going to happen?
First of all, he had the army on the border. Once you've put all the pieces in place, it's a lot easier to predict a war than saying one will happen in a place where there's nothing, on the ground that you can base that on. So part of it was, yes, you could see that the forces were there to do so. But more importantly, if you didn't think of it like an economist would say, well, that's irrational. He can't possibly win. If you tried to put yourself in the mindset of the guy, and I've lived in Russia in the past, I understand the Russian mentality to a degree, I think much more than people who have never been there. And you listen to the rhetoric they were coming out with, which was increasingly historical, nationalistic, ideological, and even theological. They were talking about the need to save the concept of a religious greater Russia, because the area of eastern Ukraine in particular is almost holy territory to the Russians. It's where the Russian people, the Rus, in their own kind of like group psychology, see themselves as having emerged. So the idea of that becoming part of a separate country, which gravitates into a Western sphere rather than a Russian sphere, just is giving them a kind of a schism they can't cope with mentally. You put all that together, and it really wasn't difficult to predict that in a more mercantile, aggressive world, Russia would think, you know what, we can go in, blackmail the world with the price of commodities. If we have to destroy Ukraine, we have to destroy it. That just makes our wheat more valuable, given there'll be no Ukrainian wheat. And to say this is a zero-sum game in which we emerge relatively better off.
But going back to that phrase mercantilism, because I don't think we actually unpacked that and defined that. Do you mind just unpacking that for me? Like, what does it actually mean? And I remember that I heard you say somewhere in the past, I think it was like 200 or 300 years, that we've seen a form of this, like to this extent. Like, is that kind of where we're going? 17th, 18th century mercantilism?
It's loosely defined in the same way that another word we're hearing a lot at the moment, which is closely related to it, fascism, is also very, very loosely defined. Fascism can mean everyone who doesn't vote the way that I like, or it can mean Hitler, it can mean whatever you want, right? It can also mean elements of industrial policy that we're seeing in the US and China and Europe today. So it's a very broad church. Mercantilism effectively is the government and the private sector looking at the national economy as if it were a business. Because when we look at economics, one thing you see in the neoclassical school is that everyone's better off if we trade together. That's part of their view. But naturally, that means some people run surpluses and some people run deficits. And New Zealand, for example, is a country that loves free trade and is wedded to it, as is Australia, nearby, of course. But is much happier when they run a surplus than a deficit, even if a lot of the time they run a net deficit. But many countries are unhappy running a net deficit, and many countries are wedded to running a surplus. When you get the state working together with the private sector, which is again where it intersects with fascism to a degree, saying, no, we want to ensure that we always run a surplus rather than a deficit. And not only do we run a surplus, we run a surplus at the commanding heights of the economy. So we own the juiciest parts of the value chain. So we're not just exporting low value stuff, we're exporting all the high value stuff where all the good jobs with the good salaries are. And we're only importing the cheap stuff, which is how any business makes money, right? No business makes money saying we're going to specialize in the low value added stuff and import all the high value added stuff because you go bankrupt. When a national economy starts thinking like that, that's when you move towards mercantilism. Now, in the old days, it was much simpler. all you were trying to do was draw in money to your economy. Because when we had fixed money that was based on silver or gold, if you were running a trade deficit, all the money left your country. That happened a lot in Europe in the old days. You literally didn't have any money. Everyone was like, well, we can't do business. There are no coins. How are we going to do anything? And so mercantilism was a response to try and deal with that, to make sure all the money flowed to you. So you had the money to pay for an army, pay for scientists, pay for innovation, et cetera, and you could invade others and they couldn't invade you. It was a very defensive strategy. Now, nowadays, we don't have silver or gold. We have the US dollar, which is much more flexible for some. But the same principle is re-emerging, and the dollar is becoming similar to silver or gold in the past. But how we define that will vary. How we will act on that will vary. But an element of it will be, as I already alluded to, similar to the US Inflation Reduction Act, which is let's use the power of the dollar and the power of the US market to bring supply chains back to the US.
Okay, and that's kind of ultimately where I want to go to, just to get a feel for how quantitative easing might still be, I guess, allowed to persist in the new world, especially if there's this new mercantilist regime, especially if, like we've already seen, that central banks can influence everything on the demand side. We're now going to start targeting the supply side. Is that kind of what we're going to see here? The Inflation Reduction Act is maybe giving us a clue that that's where it's going, where central banks will start to lend as long as it's for supply chain stuff or for a green energy transformation. Is that right?
That's my view. We've currently taken a big step back from that, because what we've seen happening is central banks moving ahead with QT, which is the reverse of QE, and aggressive rate hikes. And in the UK in particular, I'm sure many people have followed the news there, the Bank of England effectively, even though they denied it, taking part in a quasi-coup and not buying government bonds because they didn't like the government's fiscal strategy, whereas previous fiscal strategies were all okay, regardless of how silly they were, and therefore blowing up financial markets and forcing that particular government out of office. But doing that in a direction which is to tighten fiscal policy rather than loosen it, both on the supply side and the demand side. So we've temporarily taken a step back from that. But I think we will find that's going to be every bit as much of a disaster as every other policy that we've tried. It's going to guarantee a recession turns into a depression, sadly. And we will ultimately, using a logical perspective, which is how I forecast things, come back to a world in which, yes, the central bank will say we need to raise interest rates to clamp down on demand. And we are doing that, and we'll keep doing that. But we need to make sure money flows into the supply side, this mercantile side, for factories, for commodities, for value added, for defense, for all these things. We can't do that with a high interest rate because you can't afford it. Therefore, the central bank will do the equivalent of QE or MMT, which is where we come to my post-Keynesianism, and we will pay for or backstop parts of that, but only in a very rigid supply side fashion. We won't bankroll demand or house prices or anything like that, but we will do it for key industrial and commodity infrastructure.
That's pretty extreme. I got to confess, like that's quite phenomenal, because what you're effectively saying is there's going to be QE, it will persist, but for the rest of us, it's higher interest rates. Is that right?
We're not there yet. I'm making a long run forecast, and I think we'll make lots of mistakes before we get there, but I adamantly stick to it, because if you look at the grid of every other policy option you can try, none of them will work.
Yeah,
none of them will work. I'm not saying what I am projecting will work, because there are clear flaws with that too. Number one is zero sum, which means it's all against all, which means we will see the world separate into blocks, which I think is already happening anyway. I've been predicting that for a long time, looking at exactly the same dynamics I'm describing now. But it will accelerate that process, and there'll be resistance to it. And separately, if you're going to give politicians carte blanche to spend money, they're going to waste it. Of course they are. The private sector wastes it when it had QE. I mean, look at the ridiculous bubbles we've had in the private sector with QE. You think we won't have that in the public sector? Of course we will. Will there be a backlash? Of course there will. But nothing else will work. Belt tightening, disaster. Tax cuts for the rich, disaster. Cut interest rates, disaster. The only combination that logically will work, and I stress logically, even though there will be bumps along the way, is higher interest rates to choke off demand, and effectively zero money or zero cost money via central banks into the key parts of the economy that the private sector won't invest in. I mean, let me give you a concrete example again. We currently need massive fossil fuel investment, short-term, and massive green investment at the same time, in parallel. Everyone knows we have to go green. There isn't enough green stuff. That's going to involve enormous investment in supply chains to try and get all those minerals, which there isn't physically enough supply of, online. At the same time, we've got a global shortage of diesel. Now, New Zealand's a farming country. You don't have diesel, you don't have tractors, you don't have food. But we have a shortage of diesel because we don't have any refineries. We need to build refineries. What's the business case for building a refinery when you're going to be told it's going to have to shut down before it pays itself off? Because you'll need it for a few years, but then hopefully within another few after that, you've gone green and you can turn the whole thing off. Which private sector company is going to invest in that? And the answer is nobody. So do we sit there with fossil fuel prices at a level that force people to starve in parts of the emerging world? Or do central banks say, you know what, we can break some of these holy sacrosanct trade rules and central banking rules temporarily to try and win a war against both climate change and global poverty and hunger, even if that also means that we have to break up the neoliberal view of a one world system with one interest rate and central banks aren't allowed to channel money to governments? Something's going to give. Something's going to give. I hope what I'm saying is going to give, because if we stick to the rigid rules, it will be hunger that gives. It will be poverty that gives.
Going back to that private sector, they will probably never be incentivized to step in and start building the infrastructure that we need to build for the world that we need to be moving into. And we know that because when interest rates were low, they didn't do it. So they won't do it when interest rates are high, right? And so the central banks are willing to backstop it. And now we can kind of start to see a picture of how, I guess, each national economy can be powered to enter into this new mercantilistic world, because the central bank is effectively building the rails that we need to be present for that new world. Is that kind of like, and it's hard to kind of judge the distance of this event, right? Like we're looking at this from pretty far away, and these events look really stacked up close to each other, but there could be quite a decent gap. And like you say, there could be some mistakes and some bumps along the way. But is that just like kind of the story of the central bank reinventing its role within its nation state?
I think the central bank is constantly reinventing its role to try and keep relevant. And I think that's the only way for them to move forward. Again, this is a longer run vision, but it's developing very quickly. And I think it will develop even more quickly as we move towards greater geopolitical tension. But if we don't go that route, to extend the analogy you were just giving there, if the central bank isn't doing this via the cost of money, the only other way we can do it logically is to turn off every channel that money can flow into, so that private capital can't fund anything else but that. So if we don't want to go through a partial deglobalization via the route I'm suggesting, it has to be by saying, well, I'm sorry, but you can't invest overseas. You can't invest in this sector. You can't invest in that sector, which, by the way, that plus a combination of what I'm describing is exactly how the world used to operate prior to the 1980s. The Western economy, as we take it, from 1945 to around the late 70s, operated pretty much on the basis I'm describing, certainly up until the early 1970s when the gold standard first broke. You couldn't move money from one country to another. You couldn't invest cross-sector. There were credit allocations from the government and from the central bank into this industry or that industry, and they were hypothecated. So industry could borrow at 4% and agriculture could borrow at 2%, for example. That's the way we built the backbone of the Western economy that built the middle class that we've eviscerated over the past 40 years. So it's not that I'm coming up with science fiction that's never existed. I'm describing something that we thought was pragmatic and normal post-World War II. And we put it in place because pre-World War II, we didn't have it in place. And we ended up with World War II as a result.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm just saying we go back to what worked before to stop the madness.
Yeah, whenever you're in a sticky spot of bother, just retrace your steps that you took to get into that sticky spot of bother, and it makes sense, right? What was the last thing that worked? Just keep doing that.
But
And
I can't tell you how deep the resistance to this is, though. Not just
I bet.
institutionally, from a generation or two who have learned nothing but what we've done recently and don't know this history. And when you present it to them, they're just gobsmacked. It's like showing someone a picture of someone with a beard before they came back in fashion, or flares, and saying, "What's this? This doesn't exist." It's like, yeah, that was what my dad used to have. It's like, I remember when people said there'd never be beards again. It's like, in another few years, maybe there won't ever be beards again. But, we have to look at what fashion does. It comes in circles. But yeah, there's no real alternative to this. But the denial is very, 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 very deep. And if you look at markets, the financial market side, look, in conversations I have with people on the money management side of things, total denial of this, apart from the very, very tip of the iceberg, the very top of the tree, who understand the bigger picture that I'm describing. Everybody else is sitting there in denial, utterly refusing to recognize what's going on, grumpy and angry about the higher interest rates we're seeing, and just crossing their arms, going, well, they're going to change their mind at some point and they'll cut interest rates again, and then we're going to put all our money here. They are not looking at saying, okay, we're going to adapt to a world of 4, 5, 6% interest rates and thinking about how do we finance the industrial sector again. Nope, they're just waiting for that first sign of a pivot so they can leverage themselves up 20 times and go into some exotic derivative and make money doing that.
The truth hurts, though. The truth hurts. So how about we have a chat about CBDCs, so central bank issued digital currencies, because I think this is kind of like where maybe we're looking at one of the tools that will be used to do what you were just describing before, where maybe it's 2% for agri and it's 4% for another sector. And maybe that's how the cost of money will be manipulated to incentivize certain areas. Is that kind of the idea, that not necessarily by design, but central banks will end up using central bank issued digital currencies to program where the money needs to go?
Or be by design. That's why it's coming in. Now, initially, when they were floating that was a few years ago when we felt we were in a deflationary slump and we couldn't create enough demand. And that idea was being toyed with in the background because it would allow you to set negative interest rates wherever you want. Because effectively, if all money's digital and you can't physically control it, you can't hide it under the bed. And you can say, right, we've now got a negative 3% interest rate. So 3% of your savings will disappear every year if you don't go and spend it. It was going to be a tool to force you to spend. That was the idea. That's still there if we go back down that road. But what it's actually being brought in to do now is to try and make sure that, yes, you can channel it where you want it to go. And at the same time, internationally, given supply chains are international and will remain so, you can force where money goes between countries. For example, China can phone you up and say, we'll take all the milk powder that you want to sell us, and we'll pay you a 50% premium, but you're only going to get paid in digital renminbi on your mobile phone rather than through your bank, and you can't spend that in New Zealand. You can only spend it via Alibaba to buy stuff from China. And you effectively, if you go down that route, you've decoupled yourself from the Kiwi economy, completely decoupled yourself. That's the route we're going to be going down imminently.
When you say imminent, how many years are you thinking that before this is actually happening?
Not very many.
Wow, if any.
Yeah.
Whew. So going back to this mercantilist world that we might be tracking towards, thinking now from a New Zealand perspective, we're obviously supplying China with a lot of milk right now, right? I think it's almost a third of our exports are going in that direction. And I'm just wondering, how do multiple nation states form these little new units in this new world? Like, is New Zealand just going to be thought of as a center of resource, or are we going to have, are we going to be entering into a good place going forward financially, economically in New Zealand, or is it going to get a little bit darker? Are we just going to be raped and pillaged of our cows?
Well, look, that's a very gloomy way of looking at it. I don't think anyone's going to be raping any cows, I hope. But
hopefully not. Hopefully not.
I would certainly say that New Zealand has all the key ingredients to thrive. But to do that is going to have to reinvent itself, as every economy is. It's not only a Kiwi problem. New Zealand did that brilliantly in the 70s when the UK walked away from the Commonwealth and from the free trade that it had with New Zealand and moved towards Europe. And New Zealand had to pivot and become a free trader and an exporter much more to Asia. Well done. If that risk had been put to you 2 years before it happened, you would have worried and panicked and thought, what can we do? You went through the changes, you adapted, you thrived. you're going to have to do something similar again, because you have all the key ingredients to continue to thrive. That's great. You just have to recognize the environment within which you can sell them will shift. It's no longer going to be just plucky little New Zealand selling to, you know, an elite selection of countries where you get to pick and choose and everyone pays a premium. It's probably going to have to be on a block basis, because blocks are emerging and they will be forced on you by central bank digital currencies, by this mercantilism, by the fact that there is power in strength, or strength in power, rather, sorry. That, you know, for example, if milk producers in Australia and New Zealand and Canada and the US and Europe came together, that's basically all global milk production. So if all of you work together behind one digital currency, one clearing block, basically the West collectively gets to determine who can buy milk and using which currency, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm still optimistic for where New Zealand can sit within this, but only if it recognizes that the position it sits in is going to have to change.
And what I'm picking up from you is that often when you're talking to people, there's a sense of they don't necessarily believe this. They haven't yet come to grips with the fact that things are changing in this way. Is that right?
Well, there is exactly that. I mean, look, I fully get that, because you've had a generation that have done very well from one particular model, and it's really hard to get someone to change something that works well and exchange it for something that won't work as well for a significant period. Very sympathetic. Secondly, we're talking really meta stuff. I've been talking about a meta crisis all year, which is what we see around us. And you're asking farmers to suddenly say, right, can you suddenly view things from a long run historical perspective? Can you understand great power relations and grand strategy? And can you slot that onto your balance sheet, please? At a time when your politicians are falling desperately short of it and your central banks couldn't find their backside with both hands. So, you know, why should we expect farmers to be doing this alone? I have full sympathy for it. What you do need is far better leadership collectively at a national level and within disciplines like economics, which is falling desperately short once again, as I said at the beginning. But if they're not going to do it, great. Farmers are going to have to stand up and lead them intellectually. And frankly, I'd rather be led by a farmer than an economist.
Amen to that, brother. Oh, that's good. So, hey, we've come to the end of our time here, Michael. But as we finish up, is there any parting words of wisdom that you want to leave our audience with?
Well, I mean, you can come up with the cliches like be the change you want to see in the world, and I think that is important. But just recognize that the long run path for New Zealand remains a healthy, happy one. But that doesn't mean you can't have potholes in the road in front of you, and those who prepare for them will have the smoothest journey ahead.
That's really good. Really good. I'm going to put that on my fridge. That's awesome. Michael, thanks so much for your time. I'll put some links in the show notes of some of the recent stuff that I found when I was just researching you as well. Global strategist at Rabobank. Thank you again for your time. Wish you all the best.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Cheers.